Jack the Ripper remains one of history's most elusive figures, a serial killer whose true identity seemed destined to remain forever out of reach. For more than a century, the case stood as a symbol of unanswered questions and unfinished justice. Until now. Advances in modern science have brought new claims to the forefront, including DNA recovered from a shawl found at one of the crime scenes, evidence said to produce a definitive match. But long before DNA entered the conversation, there was a witness. In 1888, a man came face to face with the individual responsible for the murder of Catherine Eddowes. He was certain of what he had seen. The police were equally certain. Yet when the moment came, the witness refused to testify. For generations, speculation surrounded his silence. It was not intimidation. It was not bribery. The truth, buried in private correspondence and sealed records, was far more complex. Senior officials later acknowledged in internal memoranda that they believed they knew the killer's identity. A name was written down. A suspect was followed into confinement. And still, the case was allowed to remain officially unresolved. What happened inside that identification room, and why the witness walked away, has remained one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the investigation. The murders themselves began quietly, without warning. In the early hours of Friday, August 31st, 1888, while most of London slept, violence came to the streets of Whitechapel. At approximately 3:40 a.m., a cart driver named Charles Cross noticed a dark shape lying in Bucks Row, now known as Durward Street. As he approached, he realized it was the body of Mary Ann Nichols. She was 42 years old, a mother of 5, and had been denied entry to a lodging house less than an hour earlier for lack of 4p, the cost of a bed for the night. Her injuries were devastating. Her throat had been cut twice, severed so deeply that the wounds reached the vertebrae. Her abdomen had been violently slashed, leaving a jagged opening through which her intestines protruded. Disturbingly, several of these injuries were not discovered until later at the mortuary. Her body had already been washed, an early indication of how limited forensic procedures were in the Victorian era. Just 8 days later, on Saturday, September 8th, the brutality intensified. At dawn, the body of Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. She was 47 years old. Even experienced medical examiners were shaken by what they saw. Her throat had been cut. Her abdomen had been opened completely. Her uterus, part of her bladder, and sections of her vagina had been removed. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, who examined the body, concluded that the organs had been taken in what appeared to be a single, deliberate motion using an exceptionally sharp blade, at least 6 to 8 inches long. This marked a turning point. Fear spread rapidly through the East End, driven by the realization that the killer possessed both anatomical knowledge and precision. Then came the night that would define the terror. In the early hours of Sunday, September 30th, a sequence of murders later known as the Double Event unfolded. At approximately 1 a.m., Elizabeth Stride, aged 44, was found in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street. She had suffered one clean incision to the throat and no further mutilation. She would be the only canonical victim not subjected to additional injuries. Many investigators believe the killer was interrupted when Louis Deemschutz drove his cart into the yard moments later. Less than 45 minutes passed before the violence resumed. At 1:45 a.m., Police Constable Edward Watkins discovered the body of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. This attack was markedly more savage. Her face had been slashed, making her the first victim to suffer facial mutilations. Her abdomen had been torn open, her intestines removed and placed over her shoulder. Her left kidney and the majority of her uterus had been taken. Later, a blood-stained fragment of her apron was found roughly a third of a mile away in Golston Street. Nearby, a chalked message on the wall read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Fearing unrest and potential riots, Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren ordered the message erased before it could be photographed, an action that permanently destroyed what may have been critical evidence. The final canonical murder occurred weeks later, on Friday, November 9th, 1888. At 10:45 that morning, Thomas Bowyer, an assistant to a landlord, opened the door to a small room at 13 Miller's Court. What he found inside was unlike anything seen before. Mary Jane Kelly, just 25 years old and the youngest of the victims, had been murdered indoors. The privacy of the room gave the killer time, nearly 2 hours, according to doctors. Her throat had been cut down to the spine. Her face had been mutilated beyond recognition, with her nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears partially removed. Both breasts were severed. The skin and tissue of her abdomen and thighs had been stripped away. Her heart was removed entirely and never recovered. Her former partner, Joseph Barnett, could identify her only by her eyes and ears. These crimes unfolded in a district already pushed beyond its limits. Whitechapel in 1888 was defined by overcrowding, poverty, and desperation. Nearly 900,000 people lived in London's East End, with approximately 250,000 packed into Whitechapel alone. Population density reached nearly 189 people per acre, almost 4 times the citywide average. Charles Booth's 1891 survey revealed that more than a third of residents lived in extreme poverty, unable to afford even basic necessities. Streets such as Flower and Dean were described as among the most dangerous and degraded in the entire city. 1 in 4 children died before the age of 5. A bed in a common lodging house cost 4 pence a night, the same amount Mary and Nichols lacked on her final evening. Police estimated that roughly 200 women engaged in what they termed very low-class prostitution in the area, alongside approximately 62 brothels. All 5 canonical victims had turned to prostitution as a means of survival. The killer exploited that vulnerability with devastating effect. The social environment further intensified the tension. Between 45,000 and 50,000 Jewish immigrants lived in the district, many fleeing pogroms in Russia and Poland. Their arrival increased competition for housing and work, fueling resentment and suspicion. Jacob Adler, a Yiddish theater actor who lived through the period, later recalled that he had never witnessed such profound poverty, not even in Russia or the worst slums of New York. As fear gripped the streets, the investigation itself struggled under the weight of internal disorder. Inspector Frederick George Aberline, a veteran officer with deep knowledge of Whitechapel's labyrinthine streets, led the ground-level effort. Above him, leadership was in turmoil. Robert Anderson, head of the Criminal Investigation Department, left for medical leave in Switzerland on September 7th, 1 day before Annie Chapman was murdered. Superintendent Thomas Arnold went on leave on September 2nd. James Monroe resigned as CID head on the very day Mary and Nichols was killed. Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, already under scrutiny for his decisions, resigned in November 1888. Despite these challenges, the police committed extraordinary resources. An additional 143 plainclothes officers were deployed. More than 2,000 lodging house residents were questioned. Approximately 80,000 circulars were distributed throughout London. Yet the fundamental tools simply did not exist. Fingerprinting would not be introduced until 1901. Blood typing was unknown. Crime scene photography was not standard practice, particularly outdoors. Without these methods, investigators could only hope to catch the killer in the act or extract a confession. Jurisdictional divisions compounded the difficulty. Most of the murders fell under the Metropolitan Police, but Catherine Eddowes was killed in Mitre Square, territory controlled by the City of London Police. Coordination was limited. Communication was imperfect. And in the narrow gap between what was known and what could be proven, one of history's greatest criminal mysteries was allowed to endure. The investigation was further weakened by division. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police operated as separate forces, sharing information inconsistently and often inefficiently. This lack of coordination would later prove disastrous for historians and investigators alike. As noted by editor Chida Tranitund, most of the City of London police files connected to the murders were destroyed decades later during the Blitz in World War II, erasing a substantial portion of the official record. As the murders unfolded, another element began to shape the legend of Jack the Ripper, one that would blur the line between fact and myth. Letters began to surface, drifting through the case like sparks in the darkness, each one deepening confusion rather than clarity. The first arrived on September 25, 1888, addressed to the Central News Agency and later known as the Dear Boss letter. When it was published 2 days later, it introduced a name the world had never heard before, Jack the Ripper. The writer taunted the police, boasting about evading capture and describing his intention to continue killing women until he was stopped. He mocked investigators openly and even joked about cutting off a victim's ears and sending them to authorities, just for fun. The tone was disturbingly playful, and the public response was immediate. Newspapers printed the letter. Londoners whispered its contents to one another. Almost overnight, the name Jack the Ripper became inseparable from the crimes, as though it had been waiting to surface. On October 1st, 1888, a second message arrived, the postcard later known as Saucy Jackie. It referenced a double event and suggested that one victim had screamed before dying. What unsettled investigators was timing. At the moment the postcard appeared, details of the double murder had not yet been fully released to the public. For years, this raised the possibility that the writer possessed inside knowledge. That theory took a dramatic turn in 1931, when journalist Fred Best claimed that he and a colleague had fabricated both the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard to keep public interest and newspaper sales alive. His admission cast a long shadow over the entire correspondence, transforming what once seemed like direct communication from the killer into possible media manipulation. Yet one letter refused to fade into obscurity. On October 16, 1888, George Lusk, head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small package through the mail. Inside was half of a preserved human kidney, accompanied by a note that began simply, "From hell." The writer claimed the kidney had been taken from a victim and that the other half had been fried and eaten. Unlike earlier letters, this one was crude, misspelled, and unsigned. It lacked the theatrical flair of Jack the Ripper and felt raw, almost unfiltered. Dr. Thomas Openshaw examined the organ and determined that it came from a woman around 45 years old who suffered from Bright's disease. Catherine Eddowes, murdered on September 30th, had her left kidney removed, and her remaining kidney showed signs of the same condition. That single medical detail kept the From Hell letter alive in investigative memory long after the others were dismissed. While the public fixated on letters and rumors, senior police officials quietly formed their own conclusions. In February 1894, Sir Melville Macnaghten, Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, drafted a confidential memorandum outlining the suspects he believed most significant. This document would shape Ripper investigations for generations. His first suspect was Montague John Druitt, a barrister born in 1857, whose body was recovered from the River Thames on December 31, 1888. Macnaghten believed Druitt's family suspected him of the crimes. However, his account contained serious errors. He described Druitt as a 41-year-old doctor. He was actually 31 and a barrister, and records showed Druitt was in Dorset the day after Mary Ann Nichols was murdered. These inconsistencies quickly weakened the theory. Macnaghten's second suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel. He wrote that Kosminski harbored intense hatred toward women, particularly prostitutes, and suffered from severe mental illness exacerbated by long-standing destructive habits. Macnaghten believed Kosminski had violent tendencies and considered him one of the strongest possibilities. The third name, Michael Ostrog, was described as a Russian doctor and habitual criminal. But later evidence revealed that Ostrog had been confined in France during the period of the murders, effectively eliminating him as a suspect. Even with these names on record, certainty remained elusive. In 1910, Sir Robert Anderson, former head of the Criminal Investigation Department, published his memoirs. In them, he claimed the police had effectively solved the case. According to Anderson, eyewitness had positively identified the murderer but refused to testify. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson later annotated Anderson's book, naming the suspect as Aaron Kosminski. Swanson also explained the silence. The witness, widely believed to be Joseph Lewenda, was Jewish and did not want to be responsible for sending another Jewish man to the gallows. With no testimony, the case collapsed quietly, and the truth slipped back into obscurity. As time passed, speculation filled the void left by evidence. One of the most sensational theories emerged in the 20th century, claiming that Queen Victoria's grandson, Prince Albert Victor, had secretly married a Catholic woman, and that royal physician Sir William Gull murdered prostitutes to conceal the scandal. Popularized by Stephen Knight in 1976, the story captivated audiences. But official records showed the prince was not in London during any of the murders. He was documented in Yorkshire or Scotland on each date. Even the primary source behind the claim later admitted it was fabricated, and the conspiracy unraveled. In 2002, another high-profile theory appeared when novelist Patricia Cornwell accused the painter Walter Sickert of being Jack the Ripper. She cited DNA from letters and paper watermarks as evidence. Yet Sickert may have been in France during the killings, and the DNA samples matched a large portion of the general population. Many experts also believed the letters Cornwell relied upon were hoaxes. One of the foremost Sickert scholars, Anna Grutzner-Robbins, stated plainly that there was no credible proof. And so the letters remained unresolved artifacts. Suspects drifted in and out of favor. The most extreme theories collapsed under scrutiny. The case stayed tangled, shaped by competing narratives and shifting interpretations. Just as in 1888, the truth seemed to move constantly, never settling, always just beyond reach. That changed in the modern era with a piece of fabric and a man convinced he had finally found the answer. In 2007, British businessman Russell Edwards purchased a silk shawl at auction. Its provenance was dramatic. The shawl was said to have been taken from the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder by acting Sergeant Amos Simpson and passed down through his family for generations. Edwards believed the fabric might still carry biological traces from both victim and killer. Determined to test that possibility, he approached Dr. Jari Lehalainen of Liverpool John Moores University and asked him to examine the shawl for DNA, setting in motion the latest and most controversial chapter in the Jack the Ripper story. In September 2014, Russell Edwards took his claims to the global media. He announced that DNA testing had, in his words, definitively, categorically, and absolutely proven that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. According to this account, blood found on the shawl matched a woman identified as a great-great-great-granddaughter of Catherine Eddowes. In addition, epithelial cells recovered from a semen stain were said to match a living female descendant from the maternal line of Kosminski's sister, Matilda. 5 years later, in 2019, Dr. Jari Lehalainen and David Miller of the University of Leeds published a peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, Volume 65, Issue 1, pages 295 through 303. They described their work as the most systematic and advanced genetic analysis ever conducted on the Jack the Ripper case. The authors reported identifying mitochondrial haplogroup T1A1, a lineage more frequently found among Eastern European Jewish populations. They also claimed that phenotypic analysis suggested the suspect had brown hair and brown eyes, a conclusion they said aligned with certain eyewitness descriptions from 1888. At first glance, the narrative appeared compelling. It suggested that modern science had finally accomplished what Victorian investigators could not. But under closer scrutiny, the DNA case began to unravel. One of the earliest and most serious challenges came from within the field of forensic genetics itself. Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys, the scientist who invented DNA fingerprinting, along with other experts, identified a fundamental error in the published analysis. Lehalainen had recorded a mitochondrial mutation labeled as 314.1C and described it as extremely rare, claiming it appeared in only 1 out of every 290,000 people. In reality, the correct designation is 315.1C, a variant present in more than 90% of individuals with European ancestry. That single correction transformed a supposedly distinctive genetic marker into one that was overwhelmingly common, stripping the shawl profile of any meaningful uniqueness. The problems did not end there. In the 2019 paper, the authors did not release full mitochondrial DNA sequences. Instead, the results were presented as color blocks within a figure, making independent verification impossible. When questioned, the researchers argued that the UK Data Protection Act prevented them from publishing complete sequences. That explanation was strongly disputed by Walter Parson, a leading mitochondrial DNA expert at Innsbruck Medical University. Parson stated that mitochondrial DNA poses no real privacy risk and emphasized that full sequences are essential for proper scientific evaluation. Without them, readers were unable to assess the validity of the conclusions. The paper also contained a contradiction that proved difficult to ignore. In one of its central illustrations, Figure 7, the authors showed 2 nucleotide differences between the shawl sample and the suspect profile. Yet the paper itself cited SUGDM guidelines, which clearly state that 2 or more differences are sufficient to exclude samples as originating from the same source. In effect, the figure indicated exclusion, while the text claimed match. The situation worsened when external complaints prompted the journal's editor to request access to the original raw data. The authors responded that the data were no longer available, citing instrument failure and other complications. In September 2024, the Journal of Forensic Sciences issued a formal expression of concern regarding the paper, a significant warning within the academic community. Even if the genetic data had been flawless, the shawl itself presents severe problems. From a forensic standpoint, it is a textbook example of contamination risk. Over more than 136 years, it has been handled repeatedly, publicly displayed, photographed, and touched with bare hands. Portions of the fabric were reportedly treated with bleach. Most damaging of all, two descendants of Catherine Eddowes spent 3 days in close contact with the shawl in 2007, making modern DNA transfer almost unavoidable. Geneticist Adam Rutherford described the entire situation bluntly, calling it terrible science and terrible history. Compounding these issues is the absence of solid evidence that the shawl ever came from the crime scene. It does not appear in any police inventory from 1888. Amos Simpson, the officer said to have taken it, served in the Metropolitan Police's N Division, which covered Islington, not the city of London, where Catherine Eddowes was murdered. Textile experts later dated the shawl to the Edwardian period, sometime between 1901 and 1910, placing its manufacture after the Ripper killings. The DNA theory, then, rests on a piece of cloth with an uncertain origin and a surface saturated with modern genetic material. To understand why Aaron Kosminski continues to occupy such a central place in the story, it is necessary to step away from the shawl and examine his life. Aaron Mord Kosminski was born on September 11, 1865, in the town of Klodowa in Congress, Poland, then part of the Russian Empire. His father, a tailor, died when Aaron was 9 years old. Following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, violent anti-Jewish pogroms swept across the empire. Like many others, the Kosminski family fled west. Aaron arrived in London around 1881 and settled with relatives in Whitechapel. He lived with his siblings, including his brother Wolf and his sister Matilda, in the same impoverished district where the Ripper murders would later occur. In London, Kosminski worked intermittently as a hairdresser. By 1891, medical reports noted that he had not attempted any form of work for several years. One document described him as living in the very heart of the district where the murders were committed. Addresses on Providence Street and Greenfield Street placed him within close proximity to all 5 canonical crime scenes. By that time, his mental health had severely deteriorated. Modern psychiatric assessments of his records suggest he likely suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Contemporary medical notes describe troubling behaviors and delusions. He reported hearing voices that tormented him. He believed people were trying to poison him. He scavenged food from gutters, drank only from taps, and refused to wash or bathe. His condition worsened steadily. In 1891, he threatened his sister with a knife, an act that led to his removal from the family home. On February 7, 1891, Aaron Kosminski was certified insane and committed to Coney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, then the largest asylum in Europe. In 1894, he was transferred to Leaves Den Asylum, where he remained for the rest of his life. He died on March 24, 1919, at the age of 53. Years of neglect and poor nutrition had left him weighing just 96 pounds. His cause of death was recorded as gangrene of the leg. Despite later claims by some senior police officials that he exhibited strong homicidal tendencies, asylum records do not support the image of a violent predator. Over 28 years of institutionalization, only one clearly violent incident is documented, in January 1892, when he attempted to strike an attendant with a chair. Kosminski was profoundly mentally ill, but the surviving records do not portray him as a serial killer. The broader investigation into the Whitechapel murders remains marked by gaps, lost evidence, and unanswered questions. Officially, the Jack the Ripper case has never been solved. No suspect was ever charged. No conviction was ever secured. And more than a century later, the mystery remains open, hovering between history, speculation, and the enduring pull of what might never truly be known. Scotland Yard has never formally endorsed a single theory or named an official suspect. Over time, the documentary trail has only grown thinner. Critical portions of the historical record have vanished. Many City of London police files were destroyed during German bombing raids in World War II. Metropolitan Police suspect files later disappeared as well and were already listed as missing by the Public Record Office in 1983. The case file on Emma Elizabeth Smith no longer exists. There is no surviving police dossier devoted exclusively to Aaron Kosminski, despite later statements from senior officers indicating that he was regarded as a major suspect. In 2011, retired Detective Trevor Marriott attempted to penetrate some of this long-standing opacity. He requested access to uncensored Scotland Yard ledgers covering the years 1888 to 1892. These books reportedly contained around 36,000 individual entries, including the names of informants. The response to his request revealed just how sensitive the material remains. During legal proceedings, A senior police officer gave testimony from behind a screen to conceal his identity. Scotland Yard argued successfully that releasing the ledgers would endanger informants and undermine core policing principles, even more than a century after the crimes. The request was denied, and once again, researchers were denied a full view of what the police knew and precisely when they knew it. When all of these elements are considered together, the picture that emerges is complex and deeply unsettled. On paper, Aaron Kosminski remains one of the more plausible suspects. He lived within the heart of the murder district. He was known to the police at the time. Senior officials later identified him as a serious suspect, and there appears to have been at least one eyewitness identification. But that identification never reached a courtroom. The witness refused to testify, and without testimony, the case could not proceed. Once the flawed DNA claims are set aside, however, the evidence against Kosminski remains entirely circumstantial. No murder weapon has ever been connected to him. There is no confession. There is no uncontested physical evidence that places him at any of the crime scenes or directly links him to any of the victims. The limitations of mitochondrial DNA are central to this discussion. Mitochondrial DNA can be valuable for exclusion. A clear mismatch can show that a suspect cannot be the source of a biological sample. What it cannot do is uniquely identify one individual. Millions of people can share the same mitochondrial profile. Even under ideal conditions, if the shawl were uncontaminated and its provenance beyond dispute, a mitochondrial match could only suggest that Kosminski could not be excluded as a possible source. It could never establish that he was the killer. In reality, where the shawl is heavily contaminated and its origin uncertain, even that narrow conclusion cannot be sustained. Disagreement among senior police officials further deepens the uncertainty. In 1910, Sir Robert Anderson wrote that the identity of the Ripper was known and strongly implied that Kosminski was responsible. His colleague, Sir Henry Smith, who had been directly involved on the City of London police side, openly ridiculed that assertion and dismissed it outright. Sir Melville Macnaghten added yet another contradiction, stating that no one had ever seen the Whitechapel murderer, directly clashing with claims of a firm eyewitness identification. These were men who worked in overlapping roles on the same series of murders. Yet they could not agree on what had actually been established by the investigation. After 137 years, that is the true state of the case. The name Jack the Ripper still hangs over Whitechapel, but the person behind it remains unidentified. The story exposes how fragile forensic investigation was in the late Victorian era, and how even modern science can fail when it relies on compromised samples, uncertain provenance, and overconfident interpretation. It also reveals something more enduring: the powerful human need to assign a name and a face to an unresolved horror. As of 2025, Russell Edwards continues to press for a new inquest into the murder of Catherine Eddowes, hoping to compel the legal system to re-examine the evidence. Yet without clean, conclusive physical proof, the Whitechapel murders are likely to remain what they have been for more than a century, a mystery that refuses to close, no matter how often the world tries to bring it to an end.